saying Filipino was always kind of like, what, who, what's that?
Light waves.
I really asked my mom, like, hey, are we Filipino? So yeah, you didn't know?
Listening.
Oh girl, that's some internalized bullshit.
Tell me about the light waves. Secrets of the moon.
The Filipino story and their histories is not going to go out in a bang, it's going to go out in a whisper. Because when people stop talking about it and they stop teaching about it, no one's going to know we exist.
Set me free. Set me free.
So I identify as Filipino American. Identify as 1.3 generation because I was born in the Philippines, but you know I came here at such a young age, and so it's a definitely interesting mix because I still speak Tagalog and Filipino and still identify very much with what's going on in the Philippines or the culture there. But obviously I grew up here in the States. I grew up here in Oakland, so I could throw down.
I identify myself as a Filipina that has adapted to American culture only because the way I was disciplined and the way that I was brought up is definitely different from the way my siblings were brought up. They're born here, so they're really Americanized in the sense of being able to have more of a liberal viewpoints on things. And for me, I mean, till this day, I don't really talk back to my parents.
I grew up going to school mainly with Latinos, and they would try to punk on me because I wasn't Mexican. You know, it's just like, oh, what are you, eh? It's like, I'm Filipino.
I identify as Filipino. That's what my parents called me, like, you're Filipino.
In college, the word Pinay felt like it took on kind of an additional layer of kind of political awareness or historical awareness.
Myself, I was a little chubby brown kid just like all my other homies. So, you know, it took until like 3rd grade for me to realize like, yo, like all this time I thought I was half Mexican and half Chinese.
It's still a struggle to just even identify what I am. You know, like I've been raised American, but then you have my parents who are, you know, traditional.
The identity of being undocumented has also, you know, made me identify more with being undocumented than I do with either culture.
I identify depending on the context, like I'm sure most people do. When I'm around most Filipinos and even some non-Filipinos, I identify myself as Filipino. But when I'm in the Philippines or I'm trying to make it clear that my perspective is born out of somebody who comes from the United States and grew up in the United States, then I identify as Filipino American.
Why is it that you have to say Filipino-American? And why is it you have to say you're Indian American or like any other country that's not Western European? Like you never hear someone say like, oh, I'm British American or I'm, I don't know, like Spanish American or something like that. Like why is it that people of color have to differentiate that they're not really American? Because I was born here, so I'm like, I have family in the Midwest. I've seen like the traditional American values.
I remember some random man in the streets of Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, you know, was asking my ethnicity. You know, we get that a lot, right? Where are you from? Right? And or what are you? And so I said Filipino American because that was the thing I started to identify, the label that I started to identify with most. And, you know, this happened to be an African American man, and he said, you know, why would you even say American? Are you even proud to be American? America doesn't love you. America doesn't love us. We're people of color.
I spend a lot of time outside of the US for work. So I've been to many different countries, and sometimes when I say I'm American, you know, they get a little confused. Sort of like expecting like, you know, like an actual like American. So they have that type of illusion, but what they didn't know is America's like basically a melting pot. So, you know, there's a lot of different backgrounds.
And by American, do you mean like white?
Yeah.
Like if I were to go back, Filipinos would be like, oh, you're not Filipino, you were born in America, you're American. But if you were to go into the streets of like a typical American city, and maybe that wasn't as like diverse as San Francisco, and be like, oh, I'm American, they'll be like, no, you're obviously like not blonde hair and blue eyed, or like the typical thing you see in Hollywood.
At times I feel like my Filipino-ness is being diluted with America, but then I feel like my American-ness isn't as American, because at the same time, you know, this country has feels like have been putting a door in my face. It's like letting me in, you know, but at the same time also pushing me out. So it's very difficult for me to also identify as American, because it hurts when the country that you call home doesn't recognize you or doesn't welcome you.
Growing up, I kind of had to really observe how the American culture is, and I till this day, I mean, I really don't know like if I would call myself an American.
The reason why I consider myself a Filipino in America is because you know, I know a lot of my history and stuff. I know a lot about the culture, but at the same time, growing up, my upbringing, I never really felt like I fit into American society. I never really felt like I've been accepted.
You know, when I was much younger, to say I was Filipino didn't really bring a lot of recognition, you know, among my American classmates, or, you know, I think they kind of knew what Filipino was in terms of us not being from here.
The Filipinos I grew up with kind of had to come together, and we were just kind of known as the Filipinos, and like we all just kind of like were a group just because, you know, everyone else didn't really understand the kind of people that we were.
What it means to be Filipino American is it means an identity of struggle, as well as tapping it back into the movements in the Philippines and remembering the resistance there, but also remembering that the struggles in the US is hella real, you know, be it xenophobia, racism, homophobia.
I think growing up here as a Filipino American, we have our own ideas about gender norms. We have our own ideas about being independent or being family oriented. There are a lot of things that we don't take for granted in terms of our relationships with family and how we see ourselves in the world and related to our family, that I think Filipinos who come from the Philippines really, they just believe those things.
In terms of like traditions, for the most part, it's just been really hard to keep up with them, you know, because like I feel, you know, like when you see your grandparents or like the elders, like you manapo them, because I wasn't raised to do that. Like my parents, they understood, but then my grandparents were like, oh, you know, they kind of give you the side glance of like, oh, why isn't she like doing that?
Being Filipina, there's so many things that I feel like I have betrayed my country in not knowing my language, not knowing enough culture, not knowing my real history. I feel like there's a lot of that's also lacking. So it's also, sometimes I feel like I'm not completely honest when I call myself Filipina.
But, you know, considering the situation I'm in, I was born here. You know, I also, you know, if you want to be correct, I'm Filipino American. But I think of it in like a balanced way. Like, where do I put my weight on who I am? I'm mostly Filipino because I feel like I don't uphold a lot of the American values. But I have to also recognize that I'm born here and I have certain privileges.
So I thought, okay, Pinay, I think that's the word I find most kind of suitable for who I am and what I believe in and what I know about where I come from. I happen to like the term because, you know, again, it originated here, you know, on the West Coast and at the beginning of the 20th century, and then also just, you know, it shows all of us that you know, we were here naming ourselves. We were coming up with names to call ourselves rather than having all these other folks tell us who we are and what we look like and where we come from and where we belong and where we don't belong.
First step to happiness is like really loving you for who you are. You know, not by societal standards, not by what your friends tell you, not from like what generations of being Filipino tell you, but to be happy with who you are as a person. Then we can delve into something deeper than that. Which is like figuring out what it means to be Filipino, because I'm still trying to figure it out.
We don't exactly have a tag of exactly like what we are, because, you know, we aren't something that can be tagged. You know, we are who we are, and that's what it is.
One of the most fundamental problems around ethnic or racial consciousness is this kind of teetering back and forth towards people's call it specifically essentialism, right? Essentializing being a racialized body as a specific thing. And so, oh, I'm not Filipino enough. Oh, I'm not black enough. Oh, I'm not Mexican enough because I don't speak Spanish, right? Even us as Filipinos are constantly being reminded of these very specific things that we think are what makes somebody Filipino. But what we don't realize is that by going to the other side and creating this whole list of what makes somebody really Filipino, it creates the same sort of alienation that we felt when we didn't feel like we were American enough, or we didn't belong in this country enough, or we weren't white enough. And I'm trying very hard to create a space where students of whatever background that they are, because it's not just a Filipino thing, it's being a young thing, where we just finally can have a place where we could just be what we are, and that's normal, and that's like very rare. But when you start to hear things and share things and realize these commonalities, I think that that's very, very transgressive. I think that that's very liberatory.
Sana'y